Good morning, everyone. Hope you're all having a wonderful day today. Today, we're going to be talking about a optic that a lot of you guys have requested over the last few months because I've been doing some optic reviews. And this is the Monstrum Tactical G3 or Gen 3 1:6 first focal plane optic. Now, full disclosure, a couple weeks ago, one of the guys over at Monstrum Tactical reached out to me and said, hey, do you want to review some of our products? They watched some of my videos and thought that this would be a good fit. So basically, they sent this out to me with the mount and a rail. The rail I don't have mounted yet, so we're going to talk about that later. But we're going to talk about the G3 1:6 first focal plane and the mount. Now, it is mounted to my 16-inch AR-15 upper receiver. This is from BCA. This is my oldest rifle upper receiver. And it's a pretty fun little gun, and we're going to talk about how it fits with the 1:6. Before we get started, I did want to quickly thank the guys over at Subscribestar who directly support me. If you guys don't know, Subscribestar is basically a pro to a Patreon. You get access to early content, extra content, exclusive stuff, and you get help decide what comes to the channel first. And on top of that, you also get entered automatically into cool giveaways, which some things might be up for giveaway at the end of this month. So first up, let's go ahead and talk about price and specifications. So as of filming this video, you can find the G3 1:6 first focal plane. It also comes in an FDE, and you can find them for a little bit under $200. So in the sub $200 range for a first focal plane 1:6, I think this is one of the only options for under $200 for, again, a first focal plane 1:6. But being under $200 means that it is a direct competitor to a scope that I have reviewed very, very well in the past. This is, of course, the UTG 1:8 with the BG4 reticle. This is one of the best scopes for under $200. It's very durable. I've had these on AR-10s and AR-15s. I've owned 3 of them, and I've never had an issue with any of them. Over many, many drop tests, thousands and thousands of rounds. These are a really great scope, and today we're going to be doing a little bit of a comparison to the Monstrum Tactical. So when it comes to size and weight, it has a fairly standard size of just right at 10 inches in overall length. It is a 30mm tube, 24mm objective lens. We also have a weight on the optic itself of 16 ounces, which is actually really good for 1:6, especially one with turrets on it. We'll talk about the turrets later. The mount itself is 4.1 ounces, which means that the entire package is 1¼ pounds, which is very good, 20 ounces. So that means that this is actually a very lightweight setup for a 1:6 when you use their 30mm mount. Next up, let's go ahead and talk about eye relief and eye box. So eye relief is actually good. You get about 4 inches on 1x, and then at 6x it does tighten up a little bit, and it goes all the way to like 3.5 inches. So basically you don't really have to move your head at all when you're moving in between 1 and 6. And because of course it is that first focal plane, you do zoom in on the reticle itself. I'll get this out right now. First focal plane in a 1:6 is not my favorite option. I don't think it makes a whole lot of sense. So for me, it's not really much of a pro, and in some ways it does kind of hinder the optic. We'll talk about the reticle and first focal plane towards the end, but just know that that is not my favorite setup for a 1:6. Next up, we're going to talk about field of view. So field of view is very important on a 1:6 optic. You want to have enough field of view to where you can see stuff at 1x, especially in close range when you're transitioning, and you don't want to have to keep relying on coming off the scope every time you move from target to target. And if you can see more in your scope, it makes it easier to transition, especially on targets that are closer together. So the Monstrum Tactical has, at 100 yards, it has 103 feet of field of view on 1x, and I think it goes all the way down to 16 feet at 6x, which is perfectly acceptable. That's the standard range pretty much. Anything over 100 feet is good. Now, certain optics that I have, like the Vortex Strike Eagle Gen 2, which costs an extra $100, $120 depending on where you get it, has 116 feet at 1x, which is a huge field of view. But for the money, for $200 or a little bit under $200, the only other optic that comes close is the UTG 1:8, which it's a 1:8, so it has a little bit different magnification range. The eye relief is actually a little longer on 1x, but it tightens down tighter on 8x, which is to be expected when you get in the higher magnification ranges. But also this one here has a field of view of like 99.8, or it's like just over 100, so it's right at 100 feet, so it's right at that area where it's kind of good, kind of bad, so it's right on that line. And again, the Monstrum Tactical G3 has 103 feet, so it's just over that line on the good side. Also talking about that, let's go ahead and talk about the glass quality. The glass quality is also in the good category. It's not amazing, it's not the most crisp glass in the world, but the light transition is pretty good. Using it in low light, it's perfectly adequate. You don't need to be in direct sunlight. So light transmission is good, the color is good, and the nice thing about the image is at 103 feet on that 1X, your field of view, it's a very, very flat image. So you get kind of a tube effect when looking through it because it is, of course, a long tube, but it's more noticeable than a lot of other LPVOs, especially a little bit nicer LPVOs, little bit ones that cost more money. But the trade-off for that is the image you get is very, very flat all the way around. So even in close range on 1X, the edges don't warp as much as they do on other optics. And then the last feature before we get to how it actually performed while using it is the illumination. Now, the illumination on first focal planes can be a little bit difficult to get right because just the way that the magnification works, and it can be a kind of blurry when you're at 6x and you're on max illumination, which is 11 on this, so you have 0 through 11. It can be kind of blurry if you move your head to the left or right. You can kind of get that illumination to follow it, and so there's a little bit of blurring there on max magnification. But on 1X, it's not what I would consider daylight bright, because on 1X the reticle is very, very small, but it does help you pick it up a little faster. So you generally get a little bit of a red tint in full daylight, which is much better than just a very, very small, very thin black reticle. So while the illumination isn't excellent, it definitely does help you at 1X. It does help you pick up that really small reticle faster, just having a little bit of red tint in there, and if you're in low light situations, it pops up pretty well. But again, illumination on most LPVOs is not that great. So it's very standard, especially for $200, it's fairly good. So as far as durability goes, even though this is more of a range style optic, I went ahead and put it through the normal test. So I did a double drop test for about 5.5, 6 feet. We did a 5-shot group before and a 5-shot group after, and the impact did shift about 2 to 3 MOA. Now that can be a big deal for some people, but a double drop test on an optic like this is perfectly fine. The glass is great, there's barely a mark on it. There was a slight shift in 0, but then I went ahead and took it out to 300 yards without adjusting it, and I was still on a reduced size target. So again, 2 to 3 MOA might sound like a lot, but it's actually not that much at all. Next up on it, we did throw it into a creek, which is about 6 feet deep, and left it there for a little while, and it's perfectly fine. So it is, I believe, IPX7 waterproof. So now one thing that did actually break on here is the rear diopter setting. Now, I don't really use it, and I believe it broke during the double drop test, so it actually kind of broke the threads off of it. Now, I don't use it, so it's not a big deal for me, but if you're somebody who really needs to adjust it for your eyes specifically, then your mileage may vary, but I would just recommend not dropping it twice onto rocks. So now, if you notice here on top, like I mentioned, we have these really nice turrets. They're very aggressively knurled, they're large, they're kind of oversized turrets, and they look really, really good, and they also use my favorite retention method, which is simply, if they're down, they're locked, and to unlock them you lift up and then twist to your desired and then push down, and then they're locked in place. So I wanted to go ahead and test their accuracy, which on a 1 to 6 isn't necessarily the most important thing in the world. You're not doing like uber long range shooting where, you know, an MOA really matters at longer range, but I wanted to see not only how well they tracked, but how well they returned to 0. So I had a target set up at 50 yards, and I went ahead and did a 3-shot group. That's kind of my control group. And then I raised it 10 MOA, and I pushed it to the right 10 MOA. I dropped it 10 MOA, and I moved it to the left 10 MOA. So basically back down to the center. And it moved up 5 inches, right 5 inches, down 5 inches, and then left 5 inches. And the first and last group overlaid on top of each other, absolutely perfect. So the return to 0 and the tracking on the turrets themselves is really, really good. Better than what you should expect for a inexpensive optic like this. And honestly, a really, really good features. Most of the time on LPVOs, I don't need turrets on them. I prefer just, you know, really low profile capped ones because they're smaller, they weigh less, and they're more durable. But in this case, really, really nice, and they worked extremely well. Now, because of the reticle, I wouldn't really want to take it to uber long ranges like 500-600 yards, which is kind of stretching the limits of my capabilities as a shooter and the rifles. Just because of the reticle is not very precise, which we'll talk about that in a minute. But The turrets on here, absolutely excellent. No complaints on them. Much better than what I expected. The clicks are very nice and crisp. I believe they are half MOA. Yeah, so they're half MOA adjustments, which is standard for a LPVO. Perfectly accurate in my opinion. Zeroing very, very easy. They are resettable to 0 if you want to zero them out, but in my opinion, I don't really care because I don't really use them all that much. Really quickly, let's go ahead and talk about the mount. And the mount on here, as I mentioned, it's 4.1 ounces. They actually sent me their hollow style mount. So it has lightning cuts all the way through the inside. So there's not a whole lot of material there, which I was actually kind of worried that it was not going to be very strong. But as you saw, it held up just fine during the double drop test. The mounting mechanism on the actual mount itself is very good. You have a very long plate that mounts to your Picatinny rail, and you also have quad locking lugs on the inside that mount up against the top of the rail. So the mounting system on here is very, very good. The only thing that I would probably change on it is I would go with the non-hollow model. So it's just a solid extension on it, which is going to weigh a little more, but it's also going to be a lot stronger. So in my opinion, that's what I would go for, but this for 4.1 ounces, so a 20 ounce total package, it works perfectly fine. Now, one feature that is missing on here, and it is a very, very minor complaint, is there is no throw lever. That being said, the throw lever, there is a good amount of resistance, but and it's very smooth, but just if there was a throw lever included, that would kind of push it from a more budget style optic into something that felt really, really premium, because everything else on it feels really premium. You have decent illumination, not great, but decent illumination. You have really nice turrets that use my favorite locking and unlocking mechanism. The finish on it is really good. The throw is really smooth. It's just, there's no throw lever to help you out there. So if they do make a G4, I think that there are a few improvements that could be made. One of those, namely, is a integrated throw lever or one that you can take on and off. Either style is perfectly fine with me. So now that we've talked about everything else, I do want to say that I do think that this is a really good value. I think that it gives you a ton of features for, again, under $200. It survived everything that I threw at it, hundreds and hundreds of rounds, did not lose zero. There was a minor zero shift when you did a double drop test onto rocks, but that's to be expected. But I have no reason to doubt that this would continue to work for as many rounds as I can put through it. So let's go ahead and get to my one major complaint with the rifle. Now, or not the rifle, sorry, the optic. So as I mentioned, first focal plane is not my favorite. I don't think that it works all that well in low power variable optics. The reason for that is the ranges that you're going to be using it in. So let's talk about the BG4 reticle. Again, this optic is kind of the main competitor in the under $200 price range to the Monstrum Tactical G3. So standard zero distances, when you have like an AR-10 and 308 or a AR-15 and 5.56, generally speaking, you're going to be using a 50-200, especially with LPVOs. It's easier to zero at 50 than 100 yards, just because you're able to get a much more precise sight picture. You're able to adjust a little better there. So basically, most people are using a 50-200 or even a 100 yard zero, but let's just go with the 50-200 yard zero. So basically, first focal plane, whether you're on 1 or 6, or anywhere in between, which is the main selling point of a first focal plane, is that ballistic drop compensation, that MOA, that mil-dot reticle is the same at all magnification ranges. If you're anywhere from 0 to 200 yards, you're still going to be using that center point. And remember, it's a low power variable zoom optic on an AR-15, on an AR-10. So a lot of your shooting is going to be inside of 200 yards. So let's take something like this, where if I have a 50-200 yard zero, I'm just using that center dot for both 50, basically anywhere from 0 to 200 yards. And then at 300 yards, I can pretty instinctively know that I need to aim about 10 inches high. 10 to 12 inches high, it obviously depends on what round and what barrel length, all that sort of stuff. But basically, it's very, very easy to guesstimate, especially depending if you know what target size you're looking at, whether you're shooting at a 10-inch steel plate or a 12x18. I mean, most of the time, 300 yards, if you're using a 50-200 zero, you can still aim dead center and you'll still hit a full-size target. On an LPVO, where your main use case is close range, because I think the main draw of a low power variable zoom optic is the fact that you can use them on 1x very close, and then if you need to, you can go out to 6, 8, or 10 power. Now, the problem with first focal plane, again, especially on an AR-15, is you're not doing a lot of work beyond 300 yards. And even if you are doing 300-yard shots, whether it's a first focal plane or a second focal plane, you're either using that center dot still as your aiming point, or you're lifting just slightly above. So it doesn't matter whether I'm at 2 power or 3 power or 6 power, you know, I'm using that same aiming point for 300 yards. Now, where it would matter is, say, if you're on like 5x or 4x and you're shooting at like 400 or 500 yards. Now, the BDC that's in here is, unfortunately, it's a very simple circle dot sort of reticle. I'll put it up on screen so you have little dots that you're aiming at. Now, the problem with dots and circle shapes for your holdovers on 6x or on a first focal plane optic is that, generally speaking, they are both too small at 1x to be usable to be fast, and they are too large at 6, 8, or 10 to be precise. So this optic falls directly into that category, where on 1x, the reticle is extremely small, extremely hard to pick up. You have to get used to it and kind of tune your eyes to look for the reticle in the glass at 1x. So a lot of the run and gun stuff that I'm doing, I'm actually having it at like 1.5 to 2 so that I can actually see the reticle. And I'm suffering with a reduced field of view, but I need to see the reticle because I need to have an actual point of aim. So I don't think that the reticle in the G3 is very good at all. Now, you can make it work. I made shots all the way, you know, I was doing lots of close range work all the way up to 300 yards, and I never had a problem with accuracy, but I think that there are a lot better reticle designs out there. In fact, I kind of went ahead and designed my own that I think would work a little better. Now, I'll go ahead and put a picture of that up on screen. So it's a fairly simple design using an open triangle as your center point, and it uses a much larger, thicker ring at 1x. Now at 1x, it kind of looks almost like an EOTech or a Holosun, and it has that big, thick outer ring with that very centered dot, which is a triangle, but at 1x it just kind of looks like a dot. Now, generally speaking, the less you have to illuminate, the hotter it can get. So in this optic, in this reticle, you have a lot of dots. You have a circle, and then the center dot, and then the drop dots that are all illuminated. Now, if just the center dot was illuminated and you had a very, very hot center dot, it really wouldn't matter how small the reticle was, because you always have that really hot center dot that you can use for aiming, and it'd be very, very precise. Now, with the triangle, the advantage of having a shape that is not a circle is even on 6x, you still have a refined point to use as you're aiming. So it's very, very precise. Whereas a circle just gets bigger when you have a triangle or a chevron or anything like that. When you go through the magnification ranges on a first focal plane optic, you're still zooming in on a point, so you still have a refined point. So in the reticle configuration that I have on screen, at 1x, you have a very large, thick outer circle that's just black, and then you have a very hot center dot, which is of course the triangle. As you make your way up to 6x magnification, you now have the tip of the reticle is like your 50, 200, or your 100 yard zero, and then you have the bottom of the triangle, which again, it's open, so you can still see everything that's in there. The bottom of the triangle is 200 or 300, and then you have 400 and then 450, depending on what zero you have set up. But the point is, you still have a very, very refined aiming point. So having a refined aiming point works really, really well when you have turrets. So if you're at 500 yards, I know I need to dial like 11.2 or 11.5, whatever MOA. I can just go ahead, dial my 11.5, you know, whatever, put it down, and then I can still use that very fine, refined point on the triangle or the chevron to make my shots at long range. Now with a circle, you don't really get that, because at 6x, that circle, that solid circle, just kind of blooms out, and now it's just a chunk covering up a huge amount of real estate. So it's not very precise, whereas, you know, any point on a triangle or a chevron is, because it's a point of infinite precision. So now I'm sure, as you guys have seen on screen, on 1x, the reticle is very, very small. Even on max illumination, it's very small and it's fairly hard to pick up. You can get used to it, and it is just one of the drawbacks of the scope. And in fact, really, it's the only drawback of the scope. And I think when they make a Gen 4 or a G4, they will fix a lot of these issues. So for under $200, there really is, in my opinion, only these two scopes. You have the Monstrum G3 1:6 first focal plane, and you have the BG4 from UTG. Now, it should be mentioned that UTG also makes a mil dot and a circle dot in 1:8, and I don't recommend those scopes as they're not really good and the reticles aren't really good. The only good reticle is the BG4 reticle. Now back to the G3, I think if they improved the reticle design, they don't have to use my design, but using some sort of more precise design that works better on 1X and works better on 6X, especially that 1X, because that 1X needs to be good, it needs to be fast, because that is one of the main draws of an LPVO. If they fix that, I think that this is one of the best optics for not only $200, for like $300. So I think if they fix the reticle, they made it a little bit more usable in 1X and a little more precise at 6X, I think that this would be one of my favorite optics. But as it stands, for under $200, it's still one of the best options out there. Now, whether or not first focal plane matters to you, and if that's a plus to you, for me, it's not a plus, it's not a minus, it's just something I have to deal with on an optic. So whether any optic, whether it's second focal plane or first focal plane, I'm always having to deal with that reticle, and a first focal plane just has a more complicated reticle and a more complicated design because it needs to work in a lot larger range of environments than just a second focal plane, which just, bam, there's your reticle, that is what it is, just deal with it. So basically, if first focal plane is important to you, then this may be the best scope under $200. If you don't like first focal plane and you just want a fixed reticle design that's simpler and it works, you know, in whatever sort of environment that you're using it in, then I would recommend the UTG 1:8 BG4. All that being said, I think they are both excellent options, and I think if you own this and you like the reticle, then you are really, really going to love the optic, and I don't think that there's anything wrong with it. Having a better reticle and a throw lever would absolutely change its place in the marketplace from just kind of a budget 1:6 with the neat first focal plane to a very, very good budget optic for, you know, anything under $300. This would be a prime time contender. So that's pretty much it for the video, guys. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed. Once again, like I mentioned in the beginning, if you want to help out the channel in any way, there are links in the description for you to check out, and also you can help support the channel directly over at Subscribestar for $2, $5, or $10 a month. You get access to early content, and you get to help decide what comes to the channel first. So all that being said, once again, thank you guys for watching. I hope you all enjoyed. I will see you guys in the next one. Peace off.